Hi, and welcome to AppSecCon 2022. We're about to kick off our keynote, Security Needs Community, with Phil Venables and Nikhil Gupta. Phil is the Chief Information Security Officer of Google Cloud, where he leads the risk, security, compliance, and privacy teams. Before joining Google, he was a partner at Goldman Sachs, where he held multiple roles over a long career, initially as their first Chief Information Security Officer, a role he held for 17 years. Nikhil Gupta is CEO and founder of application security operations platform company ArmorCode, and they're going to talk about why security needs a community, Purplebug, and AppSecCon. So let's get into it and listen to what they're going to say.
Hello, Phil. Welcome to AppSecCon 2022. For everyone else, Phil needs no introduction. He's a global CISO at Google, and he is at the President Council of Advisory for Science and Technology. And I'm a big fan of his blogs. So, Phil, I really liked your foreword you wrote for the Purple Book of Software Security. Can you share why you decided to write the foreword for the book and do the keynote at this event?
Yeah, Sean. First of all, it's great to be here, and really kind of appreciate the opportunity as to do the forward and do this event. It's a great community, and again the backdrop of all of this is when you think about why this is so important is all of security is really becoming essentially software security. So to quote Mark Andreessen, software is eating the world at every level in the stack. We now see software. It's not just traditional application software. It's software in the form of firmware in hardware. It's software in the form of how we encode the configuration of systems. It's how we embed and configure business controls and IT controls in software. So everything is essentially becoming software. And so how do we secure, manage, protect, and assure the end-to-end effective integrity of that software is ever more crucial. And so it's really important to me how we think about this. Again, not just in terms of application security, but the whole software security ecosystem is tremendously important because we're digitizing the world. Software is a big part of that. We have to protect that software, and more of that software is crucial for security. So I don't think there's ever been a more important time to focus on application and software security.
Great. Now, thanks for sharing the insights here. And so from the big mega trends perspective, you mentioned about digital transformation and everything moving into application security or broadly software security. And I keep seeing that you have a lot of initiatives even at Google. And so if you could share a little bit more about the mega trends and what will be the more important things when it comes to software security.
Yeah, so I kind of like to, those of you that read my blog, I kind of, both, the Google Cloud blog that we do as well as my personal blog, we think a lot about these mega trends. And, for those of you not familiar with the mega trends concept, is, these are really these kind of macro unstoppable forces that just shape the world. I mean, in other spaces, you get these kind of demographic mega trends, you've got like energy mega trends, but in the space of software and technology, I think there's a few things we just touched on earlier about the fact that everything is being digitized. I mean, that's clearly a mega trend. Every part of society and business is digitized. We talked about that. But one of the other things that's also happening a lot, and I think all of you will witness this every day, is increasingly small and even very large businesses are basically made up of a collection of companies and service providers and vendors and services interconnected by APIs. And so when you think about, if you went back 20 years and talked about supply chain, it would be a company who's outsourced something to another company, whether it's like a call center or some support activity, or a supply chain in that you're procuring product that you integrate with your product. But increasingly now supply chains are this electronic connectedness through APIs. So again, if you're a merchant business now, you don't build your own payment system. You have an API connection and an embedded framework on your website, and a payments provider delivers that. Similarly, people don't they don't build their own HR systems or their own CRM systems. They're all API connections into other services that become part of that. So a mega trend is the world is interconnected through APIs. And so thinking about kind of API security, API reliability, managing your extended supply chain through that becomes really important. Then I think the second big mega trend, and we've seen this especially in the past couple of years with events in the software supply chain, is that people don't sit inside a corporation and write their own software from scratch. They're part of an open source community. There's many different tools and frameworks and libraries that are statically or dynamically brought into that environment. And so thinking about what the risks are in terms of whether it's understanding what's in that software or understanding the end-to-end provenance of that software becomes critical, which is why things like software bills and materials and what we and others are doing on the SALSA framework for end-to-end software reliability and software lifecycle risk management becomes important. And then the final thing I will say, which is another big mega trend, is what you might call kind of configuration as code or controls as code. The fact that most environments, especially in the cloud, but not just in the cloud, are becoming declaratively configured. So we're moving away from an era when people used to assemble hardware on premise and connect it together. We're now in an era where infrastructure is prescribed by configuration code, which is managed just like other software that instantiates a configuration. And so we have to think about infrastructure reproducibility, software reproducibility, and how all that's described in code. So again, everything is digitized. Now, I think those are the main things, but there's myriad of others that affect our world. And, I definitely encourage all of us to not just think about the tactical issues, but to think about the mega trends that are shaping your business or your sets of risks, because harnessing them or not resisting them becomes a better path to success in many respects.
Yeah, no, I think so. Thanks for sharing that. And like that point that you need to look at the mega trends so that you can see forward and see what could be impacting your particular industry, and especially the software bill of materials, which is becoming very important along with infrastructure as a code and open source. Now, it's very challenging to secure software because, if you have supply chain issues, there are multiple things, there are people and other things are there. And what do you think as a role of a community in playing and securing the software?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. So there's two ways of looking at this. So there's the community of people around how do we collectively work to improve security practices and how we think about security and what are the tools and techniques and approaches to mitigate software security risk. And so there's lots of things going on there, communities like this. There's many other types of organizations like, the Cloud Security Alliance, the OWASP organization, many other areas where I think, there's some great work going on. The other thing, which is where it kind of gets even more tangible, is in the open source community. So again, we've seen in the past couple of years, and more recently, just in December with Log4j, just how complex it can be, and how many dependencies there are on a smaller number of open source packages that are widely used and consumed. And I think we're increasingly now, as an industry and a community in partnership, doing a better job. So, for example, we are with others co-founded this thing. Many will be familiar with the Open Source Security Foundation, and we continue to support that with not just money but with a lot of people, and definitely encourage everybody to join the Open Source Security Foundation. It's if you ever find yourself in a situation or with your own management thinking, what's our risks on open source? How do we contribute? How do we make things better? Then if you're not part of the Open SSF, then you absolutely got to sign up to the Open SSF. It's not expensive and it's easy to contribute. But essentially what we're doing in the Open SSF is not just kind of getting together and talking about things. It's actually funding the implementation of toolkits, funding the implementation of frameworks, driving things like with the recent announcement we made on the Alpha and Omega project is figuring out what the most critical open source packages are, making sure that they're regularly protected and updated, and then providing tools and frameworks as part of Omega in the long tail of things where they're less widely used, but nonetheless critical in some contexts. And then there's a set of other things where we're providing, collectively through the OpenSSF, providing tools like DEPS, deps.dev, and some of the scorecards work that lets us look at dependency analysis in open source, lets us look at risk scoring of open source projects, so we can target those efforts to improve that. And then finally, as I mentioned before, with the SALSA frameworks, this is an open source framework we published and contributed to the open source community about how to think about end-to-end software supply chain risk levels. So if any of you have not seen it, the website is slsa.dev. And again, it's an ongoing maturity framework for how to think about that we're increasingly building into tools. And the way to think about this versus SBOM is, software bill of materials are very, very important. But without SALSA, you can't really know that there's integrity around what's in that software bill of materials. So the analogy, and this was on a salsa.dev blog post a few days ago, is analogies in like food safety. So SBOM, would tell you what's the ingredients inside the food that you're buying, but SALSA is the equivalent of understanding the food hygiene processes and controls and safety around how the food is produced. So the reality is you need both, and certainly in software security and how we think about software supply chain risk, you need SBOM and SALSA together. And again, all of this gets done as a community, because if we're going to have this pervasive set of controls that we need across the environment, no one company, no one product can do that. It's a function of the tech providers, the open source community, the open source consumers, and every organization that consumes and contributes to open source. And the early signs are that all of this collaboration is working well, but I definitely encourage everybody to sign up to these things.
Yeah, no, thanks, Phil. That's very interesting. And I like the analogy of, that software bill of material being the ingredients and SALSA being the framework. And it's very evident that, in this complex world of software security with suppliers and different kind of APIs and everything else, and there's no one place. And as you mentioned, there are communities like OWASP, there's communities like SALSA and, the Purple Book, because there's no one community, if you will, can solve it all. And you need to have a dedicated focus, and there's a lot of collaborations over there. And I really appreciate that you being a thought leader from the Google, but sharing and working closely with the rest of the world. So definitely I'll encourage the audience to go and look at those salsa.dev and the DEP and some of the other tools that Phil is mentioning. So it's a very, very essential. So again, while we are looking at the big picture and we are talking about future and some of the things is at the end of the day, security leader will say that's great to see the 50,000 feet. But what are the three things security leaders can do it as quickly as next week to prepare themselves well for software security?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll get really specific on these three points, and it may be maybe too specific, but I'll go there anyway. Is like, I think security leaders, we all need to create an environment where we're in our enterprises or organizations or other spaces where we're driving our development teams to improve software security, not only by education. We have to provide frameworks and tools, and so common types of security vulnerabilities should be addressed by providing frameworks and tools and services that developers can use, so that they don't have to keep reinventing the wheel of mitigating that particular vulnerability. But the important thing as well is to have this feedback loop in the software vulnerability analysis process. So we all provide, well, at least most organizations provide their developers with tooling for authentication, authorization, encryption, in many cases tooling to reduce the risks from SQL injection, cross-site scripting, all of the other types of common vulnerabilities. But what typically happens in most organizations, you're reviewing software, whether it's through manual reviews, code reviews, static analysis, dynamic analysis, fuzzing, all sorts of other techniques. The important thing is to start watching to see if there are new patterns of vulnerabilities emerging. Then that should be a trigger to fund and implement more toolkits and frameworks or adjustments to the toolkits and frameworks to mitigate those vulnerabilities more pervasively. And so it's not just important to have the tools and frameworks, it's important to have the feedback loop that can enhance those frameworks in response to thematic emergence of new types of vulnerabilities in the way your software teams are building things. So I think that's one thing, frameworks and the feedback loops to improve them. The second thing, and this is something that I recognize is very difficult for a lot of organizations, is to determine what percentage of your software is reproducible through a continuous integration and continuous deployment process. So there are some organizations that are very good at this. They have all of their code in one single repository. They're able to push it through a well-considered CI/CD pipeline, and in effect, all of their software is fully reproducible. Other organizations, for historic reasons, large legacy systems, different tools, don't have that. But unless you understand what percentage of your software is capable of being reproducibly built reliably, you just don't know what you then need to focus on. And it may be that it's not, for all organizations. I mean, ideally, you would be at 100% software reproducibility. It may be for certain types of organizations you can't get to 100%, but understanding where you are on that range is important to then prioritize where you need to invest. And then finally, and I'll mention SALSA again, is just understand what your SALSA maturity level is. There's 4 maturity levels, 1 through 4. One is basic, understanding where your software is, all the way up to 4, which is, full reproducibility, end-to-end provenance, a whole array of other controls. Understanding across all of your major software, all of your major applications and other critical software bases, what each level they're at in terms of their SALSA maturity level and what your plans to get to a higher maturity level are. So I think feedback loops on frameworks, software reproducibility, and understanding and improving your SALSA maturity levels, I think a lot of stuff comes from that. There's clearly more things, but if you focused on those 3 things, you get to address all of the other things as well, in my view.
No, that is fantastic. And I think so, because security leaders need a prescription, and it's coming from you, it kind of helps because, there's a wealth of knowledge right from the various industries to here and the level of resources you have access to. So quick question. While all these 3 descriptions are there, and, we have companies of organizations of type size of Google, and then we have companies who are like very small companies, and it boils down to resources. So I guess this is where the importance of SALSA becomes more important, that you go to the community and you leverage the work which is done by the larger organization. And back in the financial days, we used to have FSISAC and things like that. So is that kind of something on the same line where smaller companies can leverage for the maturity level and all?
Yeah. So, again, I think there's a lot more organizations and associations focused on everybody kind of helping each other. So you mentioned the ISACs. The ISACs across each of the critical infrastructure sectors, and there's many other similar things worldwide, and so-called ISAOs that are similar to ISACs, but they're not just doing threat and vulnerability sharing and coordination of kind of incidents and issues. Increasingly, they're also getting into the promulgation of good practices around software and system security. I mentioned, we've talked a lot about the Open Source Security Foundation, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation. There's a lot of other organizations that are doing just amazing work on bringing the community together to match resources in large companies to support the maintainers of open source projects. And so I think there's a lot of collaboration goes on there. I'd definitely like to see more in enterprises that mostly consume open source, but don't necessarily contribute as much as they could. I don't know, sometimes the reason for that is they're just not organized to do that, or they may, in certain occasions, they may not be willing to do that for whatever reason. But certainly all organizations that consume open source software should figure out how can they better contribute back to the community, even if it's just joining some of the associations and helping with some of the funding, all the way through to the ideal sense is, providing developer resources to help the open source maintainers and actually contribute back to the open source projects. So I think that degree of partnership, of really driving the community forward and getting everybody contributing is going to be helpful, and contribution to some of the open source projects is not just going in and looking for issues and submitting changes. It could be about helping some of the maintainers of these projects with packaging tools, with helping them kind of migrate to some of the frameworks that are being published. So it's not just contributing code. It could everything through to helping with vulnerability disclosure practices, a whole array of things. So I definitely encourage everybody to, there's a community there, there's the associations there, the foundations there. People can sign up for them and figure out a way of helping. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're consuming a lot of open source but you're not contributing back to it, then that's a pretty good opportunity to figure out a way of contributing back to the community.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think so the magnitude of the challenge with software security is so significant that, government decided to have a bunch of executive orders, and you being an advisor to the government of United States, you have a good insights. So what do you see as a role for public-private partnerships in software security?
Yeah, so we've, as you probably saw, mentioned kind of earlier in the year, we had the privilege of, with a number of other tech companies, of partnering with the White House as part of their Open Source Security Summit. We've also partnered with the government on various aspects of the executive orders that came out last year, of which a big part of those it was really good to see that they were focused on software security and focused on IT modernization, and a number of other significant architectural concepts like zero trust and various other things. So it was good to see the executive orders and a lot of the government direction from the White House, the Federal Cyber Director role, and the National Security Council roles, plus what's going on in DHS, CISA, with various new types of collaboration with industry. It's good to see it not just focus on the typical public-private partnership of threat and vulnerability sharing, but also now the public-private partnership of how do we advance means of improving security, of software security, helping the open source community, and doing that not just in sharing information and practices across the public and private sector, but actually government putting their weight behind how the federal government, how state and local governments and agencies are going to be more forceful procurers of the right things from the environment, and sponsoring back contributions in a similar way to some enterprises are doing. And so again, I think the public-private partnership is not just coordination, it's actually a whole bunch of activities now, which is great to see, because it's the activity, not just the commitment, that obviously drives us forward.
Oh, no, that's great. That's great. And Phil, I just looked at the time. I guess the time flies when you're having fun. And I think so this is a topic that we can go on and on forever. But again, I'd like to thank you here. And I'll also like to encourage the audience over here to go and read philvenables.com. I hope I got it right. It's a very good blog which talks about the mega trends and also deeply look at SALSA. And to sum it up, thanks everyone for coming to AppSecCon. Hopefully you'll have a great next 2 days, and also encourage to participate in Purple Book community and contribute to the bigger cause. So thanks once again, Phil, and thanks for coming.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to working with the community more in the future. Thanks.
Absolutely.